Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the reading of a one-shot entitled Shoto's Friend. Here's the summary. I don't think you understand, Fuyumi began sweetly, adding some seasonings to the wok with her free hand. Shoto's bringing a friend over. The line was silent then until... A friend, huh? Natsuo sounded thoughtful for a moment, before a mischievous tone took over his voice. This friend wouldn't happen to be a one Midoriya Izuku, would it? UA's resident cinnamon roll with the freckles that look like stars, and the shining emerald eyes. Oh, and how could I forget? Adorable, but could probably crush our baby brother's head with his thighs. The one and only. This fic, as I stated, is a one-shot. I love this one a lot. I hope you all enjoy it as well, and it is just shy of 4,000 words. Fuyumi scrambled around the kitchen to get ready. She gathered her hair up into a ponytail, before she then turned the hob on and grabbed the sesame oil. Her clothes were still covered in glue and glitter from work, while her glasses had smudges made by small fingerprints earlier. She loved Shoto, she really did, but he just had the worst timing. Fuyumi had barely put her foot through the front door when her youngest brother had messaged to ask if he could bring a friend over for dinner. Naturally, she was thrilled to host anyone Shoto considered a friend, but a bit more warning would have been nice. As she set the pork on the now sizzling wok, she wedged her phone between her shoulder and her ear. The line rang 4 times before her other brother finally answered. Natsuo, are you free now? She asked bluntly. No time for a greeting. And before you ask, no, it doesn't involve Dad. Well, hello to you too, Nissan, he drawled. Also, no, I'm not. I've got a date. Fuyumi could practically hear the eyebrow wriggle and rolled her eyes unimpressed. She frantically searched for an excuse to make him cancel, until her eyes eventually landed on the wok in front of her. His favorite food is pork katsudon. Could you make that? A wide grin made its way across Fuyumi's face. I don't think you understand, she began sweetly, adding some seasonings to the wok with her free hand. Shoto's bringing a friend over. The line was silent then, until... A friend, huh? Natsuo sounded thoughtful for a moment, before a mischievous tone took over his voice. This friend wouldn't happen to be a one Midoriya Izuku, would it? UA's resident cinnamon roll with the freckles that look like stars, and shining emerald eyes. Oh, and how could I forget? Adorable, but could probably crush our baby brother's head with his thighs. The one and only, Fuyumi nodded, a satisfied smirk on her face. You still thinking of going on that date? I think the fuck not, Natsuo answered easily. However, when an angry voice hummed in the background, too quiet to make out, Fuyumi heard Natsuo stutter out. Look, I'm sorry. Please, babe, this is important. We can go tomorrow instead. It's not like the restaurant's going anywhere. Nissan, give me a sec. Fuyumi impatiently tapped her finger on the wooden spoon when static suddenly filled the speaker, a telltale sign that Natsuo had put his hand over his microphone. A minute passed before the line returned to normal, and her brother spoke, slightly put out. Dinner's usual time, right? Yes. Cool, I'll be there. Bring your date if you want, Fuyumi snorted. You know how much we've all been wanting to meet her. Don't push your luck, Nissan. When Izuku was initially asked to accompany Shoto to his family's house for dinner, he wasn't worried. After all, he'd been before during their internship. He had no reason to feel concerned. However, when Shoto then informed him that he would be the only friend attending the dinner, a prickle of anxiety shot through him. Before, the attention hadn't been entirely on Izuku, with Bakugo's explosive personality filling in the awkward silences. But now, he'd be in the spotlight as the only outsider. Panic slowly consumed him. He wanted to be presentable. He wanted to be the best friend he could possibly be, despite the way his heart seemed to stutter around Shoto. He didn't want to mess things up, and give them any reason to think he was useless, worthless Deku, undeserving of Shoto's affection. He didn't know what he'd do if Fuyumi revoked her blessing, or if he accidentally upset Natsuo again. Relax, Izuku. A smooth voice jolted Izuku from his scattered thoughts, and he looked up to find Shoto looking down at him as they approached the house. I was mumbling again, wasn't I? He sighed, frustrated with himself. Sorry. Don't apologize. Shoto frowned. He regarded Izuku for a moment, studying the situation before continuing. None of those things will happen, though. You're not useless or worthless, and my siblings already think very highly of you. Izuku blinked slowly. They do? Of course, I thought that was obvious, Shoto answered bluntly. He seemed to notice that Izuku was still trembling slightly and extended his hand in invitation. Izuku's breath caught in his throat as he stared at his friend. contemplating his options before hesitantly latching onto Shoto's outstretched hand with both of his own. His stomach jolted at the contact. His friend was so warm and safe. Izuku made a mental note to do this more often. Using the opportunity to shuffle closer, he hid behind Shoto slightly. When he then looked up at the house, he saw a swaying curtain, recently touched, and furrowed his eyebrows. However, before Izuku could mention it to his friend, the door suddenly opened. Shoto! Standing in the doorway was Shoto's brother, Natsuo. Gray eyes briefly glanced at their clasped hands and smirked. And Midoriya-kun. It's nice to see you again. The pleasure's all mine, Todoroki-san. Keeping his hold on his friend, Izuku bowed. Thank you for having me. When Natsuo barked out a laugh, he quickly straightened up, bewildered at how carefree he was. Izuku expected him to be cold and broody, maybe even a little like what their class had dubbed as early Roki, but he was pleasantly surprised. Shoto's brother thrived in the absence of endeavor, it seemed. Not that Izuku could blame him. Shoto, this kid is too cute, he gushed before stepping aside. Come in, Nissan's in the kitchen. Wordlessly, the two of them passed the threshold, and Izuku reluctantly let go of Shoto's hand to take off his red trainers. When he then removed his jacket, he heard a gasp. Dude, where did you get your shirt? Izuku tilted his head to the side and glanced down at his formal shirt, t-shirt. Oh, He rubbed the back of his neck, ignoring how awestruck Natsuo looked. I made it myself. I actually have several others with similar prints. I know it's a little silly, but... That's awesome, Natsuo interrupted. You have to show me how to make them sometime. Izuku's eyes widened, surprised at the development. Natsuo-ni has similar clothes, Shoto explained after tidying their shoes. Last week, he wore a hat that said, head sock. And I'd wear it again, Natsuo announced proudly, hands on his hips as he pointedly winked at Izuku. Or maybe you could try it on, Midoriya-kun. You'd look adorable. An awkward blush dusted his cheeks, and he quickly became flustered at the way Natsuo was looking at him. It wasn't fair. Why did every Todoroki have to be so attractive? They clearly took after their mother. Izuku wondered if he'd get to meet her one day. He smiled at the thought, until a brash cough startled him. Aren't you meant to be helping Nissan? Shoto cut in, voice strangely defensive as he stepped in front of Izuku. Ooh, touchy today, are we, Shoto? Natsuo grinned. Don't you agree that Midoriya-kun would look adorable? He mumbled something that sounded a lot like, he always looks adorable. But Izuku must have misheard him, surely. Natsuo cupped a hand around his ear, thoroughly enjoying himself. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? I said I find you absolutely deplorable, Shoto deadpanned, before grabbing Izuku's hand and pushing his brother out of the way. We're going to see my favorite sibling now. Ignoring Natsuo's scandalized gasp, he called out, Fuyumi-ni, we're here. When they entered the kitchen, they saw Shoto's sister finishing up with their dinner. You're just in time, she called out as she began dishing it out. However, she paused for a moment to look directly at Izuku, then smiled. His heart skipped another beat. It's great to see you again, Midoriya-kun. Likewise, Todoroki-san, he squeaked out breathlessly. When he inhaled to recover, though, he noticed a familiar smell in the air and salivated. Wait, is that? Pork katsudan, Fuyumi finished for him with a smile. It is. Shoto's idea. He tells me it's your favorite. Izuku's eyes widened as he looked up at his friend, who scratched his cheek absent-mindedly. A wave of emotion washed over him, and he felt his eyes water ever so slightly. Thank you. His gaze darted between the siblings. That's so thoughtful. I really appreciate it. Oh, it's nothing, Fuyumi laughed as she returned the now empty wok to the cooling hob. After everything you've done for Shoto, it's the least we could do. He seems so much happier now that you're in his life, and he talks about you so much, especially when we visit our Nissan, Shoto warned, albeit the last syllable almost came out as a squeak. It was so unlike him that Izuku tilted his head to the side, shocked. When his friend noticed his gaze, he sighed. I mean, you're right. I am much happier knowing you, Izuku. He immediately flushed, heat spreading through his body at the declaration. A wide smile made its way onto Izuku's face, despite the way his pulse drummed in his ears and his stomach did backflips. Likewise, Shoto-kun, he beamed, watching the way dichromatic eyes softened around the edges. It wasn't a smile, but everyone in the room knew its significance. So, Midoriya-kun, Natsuo chirped as he strolled into the room and scooped up his bowl of katsudan, encouraging the others to do the same. Izuku humped in question, but Natsuo didn't elaborate until all four of them were sitting down around the chabudai. How long have you and Shoto been calling each other by your given names? Izuku promptly choked on his own spit. Shoto helpfully thumped his back. He wheezed before taking a sip of water to clear his throat. Fairly recently, why do you ask? Just wondering, Natsuo shrugged, gathering his chopsticks. I think it's cute. Cute? I agree, Fuyumi added, smiling almost knowingly. I have to ask, though, Midoriya-kun, how is he treating you? A wave of heat radiated from Shoto's left side, and Izuku briefly turned his head to find his friend sitting up straight, glaring at his sister. He wasn't sure why there was such hostility in that gaze, but didn't comment on it. Yeah, Natsuo rested his elbow on the table and cupped his chin in his hand. How do you feel about our Shoto? Izuku blanked. You don't have to answer these vultures, Shoto murmured softly. He then narrowed his eyes at his siblings, who released scandalized gasps. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. It's okay, Shoto-kun. Izuku reached under the table and gave his friend's hand a squeeze, unbeknownst to the other two. They just caught me off guard, that's all. Shoto regarded him for a moment, then hummed in understanding. Smiling softly, Izuku forced his eyes away and coughed awkwardly before addressing the rest of the table. Really well, actually. I couldn't ask for a better friend. Fuyumi turned toward Shoto and mouthed, Friend? Izuku ignored her. People like to joke that Shoto-kun is quite cold and distant, but honestly, I think that's wrong. He's so incredibly kind and caring, despite everything that's happened to him, and he's fiercely protective over the people he cares about. He's the only one who listens to my ramblings, and he's never afraid to speak his mind. He's strong, both in body and mind, and he's so smart. He can also be really funny. Shoto? Funny? Natsuo cut in aghast. It's not deliberate most of the time, Shoto grumbled quietly. Izuku's lip twitched with amusement. So, yeah, he finished lamely, smiling down at his Katsudan with a dopey expression. I could go on for hours about how great Shoto-kun is, but I don't want to embarrass him. In short, he's one of the best people I've ever met. The room was silent then, as Izuku's words fully sunk in. It lingered on longer than he would have liked, and he started to fidget. Had he accidentally crossed a line? A feeling of dread consumed him. He had done that the last time he had visited the Todoroki abode as well. Why couldn't Izuku just keep his goddamn mouth shut? You really mean that? Izuku's head snapped up to look at Shoto, who scratched a scar self-consciously as he averted his gaze. Don't scratch. He bit his lip and wrapped his hand around his friend's wrist before lowering it away from his face. Yes, I mean it. I'll always mean it. Shoto finally met his gaze then, searching, before a smile slowly made its way across his face. Izuku loved Shoto's smiles. They were beautiful and not nearly common enough. He enjoyed being the reason behind those smiles. I feel... Shoto swallowed heavily. The same. You're incredible, Izuku. He cut himself off then, cheeks bright red, when he remembered that they were being watched. Frowning, Izuku looked across the table to find the older Todoroki siblings smirking at them. Oh, don't stop on our account. Fuyumi waved them off before taking into her food. Yeah, just pretend we're not here, Natsuo snorted, muttering under his breath. Dinner and a show, huh? Izuku blinked dumbly at them, before turning to Shoto, hoping to be enlightened. Unfortunately, his friend merely shrugged in response. Izuku was not convinced, but instead of pushing for an answer, he chose instead to eat. Several minutes passed in silence as the four of them focused on their Katsudan. It was a little awkward, but it gave Izuku time to gather his thoughts and recover his confidence. So, Todoroki-san, I hear you're at university. What are you studying? He asked nonchalantly, between mouthfuls. Natsuo beamed at the question, and the tension seemed to slide from everyone's shoulders. The rest of the dinner passed with no issues. Izuku slid open the bathroom door and wandered out into the corridor. He hadn't been gone long, having excused himself to go to the toilet, but as he approached the kitchen, he heard voices from inside. You've done good, Shototo. He was surprised to find that Natsuo's voice had none of its usual playfulness. He sounded almost proud. Yeah, Fuyumi agreed, her tone warm. I couldn't imagine a better person to be by your side. How many times do I need to tell you? I'm not in a romantic relationship with Izuku. Shoto sounded exasperated. Was the prospect of being with Izuku that awful to think about? Yet, both siblings chorused before he could get lost in his own self-deprecating thoughts. We know you're both too chicken to ask the other out, Natsuo elaborated. But we've seen the way he looks at you. It's like you're his whole world, Fuyumi sighed. It's rather adorable, really. He cares for you. Izuku's ears burned bright red. Had he really been that obvious? I care for him, too. Shoto's voice sounded so vulnerable. And I want to be with him like that, but I'm scared. I've never felt this way about anyone before. He was my first ever friend. My best friend. I don't want to ruin that. You won't ruin it. You don't know that, Shoto grumbled. Izuku leaned his head against the wall, aching to comfort his friend. He's everything to me, but he deserves so much better than what I can give him. He deserves someone normal, not broken and ugly like me. Izuku bit his lip and pulled away. He couldn't stand by and listen to this any longer. Now that there was no contention over whether Shoto's feelings for him were platonic or not, he no longer saw a reason to hold back his own, especially when he knew his friend was hurting. Straightening his posture, shoulders back with determination, Izuku walked into the room, where he was immediately met with 3 pairs of wide eyes. Shoto somehow seemed to recover first, panic written all over his face. How much did you hear? Natsuo and Fuyumi's eyes darted between them, while their lips remained sealed. Instead of answering, Izuku reached forwards, took Shoto's hands, and bowed to the other 2. Forgive me for intruding, but can I talk to Shoto-kun in private, please? They nodded silently before scrambling out of the room and sliding the door shut. Izuku had no doubt they were pressed against the other side, ready to eavesdrop, but at least he didn't have a visual audience. He sighed at the small victory. Izuku. An almost fragile voice cut through the air. Startled, he turned to look at Shoto, forlorn and staring at the floor as if ashamed. Izuku, I'm so sorry. Don't you dare apologize, he cut in, shaking his head. His friend's mouth snapped shut then, and Izuku rubbed the back of his head, bashful. Did you mean what you said? You want to be with me as more than friends? Shoto nodded his head tentatively, his friend shielding his face from view. In a moment of boldness, Izuku reached out and brushed the hair out of his eyes. Do you trust me, Shoto-kun? With my life, came his immediate response. Izuku smiled at that. Then can I tell you a secret? I already know who I want to be with. His gaze never faltered, urging Shoto's dichromatic eyes to meet his own. However, when they remained glued to the ground, Izuku sighed. It's you, Shoto-kun. I want to be with you. His friend finally looked at him then, hopeful and intense, like he wanted to believe him, but was afraid of the consequences. Izuku never faltered, though, lowering his hand from his fringe and resting his palm against a scarred cheek. Really? Shoto breathed, leaning into the touch. More than anything, Izuku smiled softly. And you don't get to tell me who I deserve, okay? Because I can't imagine anyone more deserving of love than you. Love, Shoto whispered, inhaling deeply. No, it shouldn't be me, though. You heard what I said before. You're none of those things you said about yourself. Izuku shook his head, willing him to understand. That rambling session I had during dinner, I meant every word of it. You're amazing and beautiful inside and out, and even if you were broken, those feelings wouldn't change. I fell for Todoroki Shoto, and that's the truth. Shoto's cheek warmed against his palm, and small flames licked his hair. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing would come. Nevertheless, Izuku remained silent and waited for him to piece his words together, until he was finally ready. You need to stop falling so much, Izuku. You hurt yourself enough as it is. He blinked once, then twice, then barked out a laugh at the absurdity of the statement. Of all the things Shoto could have said, Izuku had expected a quiet acceptance or maybe more doubt, but humor. The hand-crusher strikes again, he mused to himself with a snort. However, when Shoto bit his lip to hide his own shy smile, he lowered his amusement down to an affectionate grin. I don't think you're in a position where you can tell me what I can and can't do, Todoroki-sama. Shoto huffed at that before his demeanor returned to its previous seriousness. I suppose that was rather hypocritical of me, he admitted, considering I also fell for you. Izuku's heart soared, too emotional for words. A moment passed, Shoto still searching his face. Does that mean we're now partners? Boyfriends? Only if you want that too. Izuku raised his other hand so that both cradled Shoto's face. I do, he whispered, leaning forward so his forehead rested against Izuku's own. They stared at each other, then, unable to stop smiling. Boyfriends. Boyfriends! The door slid back open as Shoto's siblings barged into the room, clearly choosing to ruin their first tender moment as a couple. Haven't you heard of knocking? Shoto tried to muster his best glare, but failed when Fuyumi wrapped him in a hug. I'm so happy for you both. You finally worked it out. I'm so proud of you. See, we told you everything would be. Hey, dickbag, we need to talk. All three heads looked up to find Natsuo standing tall and broad, oddly reminiscent of their father, complete with the threatening scowl directed entirely at Izuku. He froze with anxiety under such a look. Had he managed to fuck up somehow? Had he said something he shouldn't have? Natsuo stepped forward then, pointing an accusatory finger in his direction. When he came to a stop less than a meter away from Izuku's face, he frowned, before opening his mouth. Everyone held their breath. That's right. He turned on his heel, his animosity now aimed at Shoto. We need to set the record straight. The room, still shocked into silence, allowed Natsuo to continue. Now, as you know, Midoriya-kun is very precious to your sister and me. He's basically family at this point, so believe me when I say no funny business, got it? You will treat this boy like a goddamn king and nothing less. If you hurt our sweet angel in any way, Todoroki Shoto, then I can assure you, you will pay for it dearly, am I understood? A second passed, then 2 seconds, then... Seems reasonable. Shoto nodded, perfectly composed. It was almost laughable, if Izuku wasn't so fucking confused right now. Wait! He shimmied himself between the two brothers, hands raised non-threateningly, and shut his eyes to make sense of it all. Did you really just give your own brother the boyfriend talk? If you still think this is a normal family after everything you've seen, Midoriya-kun, then I don't know what to tell you, Fuyumi answered, pinching her brow and praying for patience. Natsuo and Shoto nodded in agreement. Izuku refrained from turning around and leaving. No, you're right. That one's on me, he nodded instead, shuffling on his feet. And another thing, Natsuo turned to regard Izuku, pouting. You gotta stop intruding on family moments so you can change Shoto's perspective of the world, please. I know it's becoming a tradition at this point, but it's really sappy for the rest of us to watch. He'll do no such thing, Shoto cut in immediately, grabbing Izuku's hand and leading him out of the kitchen. Now, if you'll excuse us, Izuku and I will be in my room. His face flushed, mortified at the responding wolf whistle, followed by Fuyumi shouting, Stay safe! As they raced down the corridor. In that moment, Izuku promised himself never to say yes to dinner with the Todoroki family ever again. All right, listeners, this concludes the one-shot Shoto's Friend. I really love this one-shot a lot. It's one I reread pretty constantly. Let me know your all's thoughts and reactions as well. If you like this and have time to run over to AO3 to leave comments and kudos to the original author, feel free to do so. I'm sure it would be much appreciated. And as always, thank you so much for listening.